Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Fall 2021 Reopening, COVID Legal Update for Schools. As school reopening is fast approaching or already here for some districts, the guidance and requirements have been shifting quickly. We're here today to take stock of the current landscape and what the changes mean for schools. I'm Kendra Yoch, and I'm excited to welcome you today. With me here are four of our Franczek team members who have been tracking the developments closely. Shelli Anderson.
Hello, everyone.
Nicki Bazer in a lovely nature location.
Hey, everyone. Coming to you live from the Poconos.
Jennifer Smith.
Hello.
And Amy Dickerson.
Hi, everyone.
We will be discussing the updated CDC and IDPH guidance, the order issued by the governor yesterday, and we'll also touch on the special education laws recently signed. Before we begin, please mark your calendar for next week's webinar. It is the next in our educational equity series, and we'll be discussing efforts to engage and re-engage families and students this year. Our guests from CPS are undertaking some really massive projects to reach thousands of families, get students back in school, and support them following the challenges from the last year and a half. And that'll be next Thursday at noon. As always, I want to remind you to submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll do our best to answer those, and if you have follow-up questions or have anything else that you want to discuss, please do contact any of us or our Franczek colleagues. So let's jump in and talk about masks. So after initially providing districts discretion to decide on the appropriate masking and other mitigation strategies for their communities, Governor Pritzker yesterday announced that masks would be required for everyone in K-12 schools, regardless of vaccination status. Amy, can you give us an overview of that announcement?
Yeah, so as we all know, yesterday Governor Pritzker announced that all individuals in all pre-K-12 schools and daycare settings in Illinois must wear a mask when indoors, regardless of vaccination status. So this requirement does also extend to indoor school athletic activities. But athletes and other individuals participating in and attending outdoor school athletic events may remain unmasked. So following the press conference where Governor Pritzker announced this, the executive order was issued and published on the governor's website. And that executive order specifically says that all public and non-public schools must follow the joint ISB IDPH guidance and take proactive safety measures, including requiring the indoor use of face coverings by students, staff, and visitors who are over age 2 and able to medically tolerate a face covering, regardless of vaccination status. The other proactive safety measure that the executive order expressly requires schools to take is to implement other layered prevention strategies to the greatest extent possible, and taking into consideration factors such as community transmission, vaccination coverage, screening, testing, and occurrence of outbreaks consistent with CDC guidance. So the executive order states that these other layered prevention strategies include measures like physical distancing, screening, testing, ventilation, hand washing, and respiratory etiquette, advising individuals to stay home when sick and get tested, contact tracing in combination with appropriate quarantine and isolation, and cleaning and disinfection. So these are the other layered prevention strategies that the executive order says that schools must implement to the greatest extent possible, in addition to the requirement for universal masking.
Okay. In that announcement during the press conference, he also had an opportunity to answer some questions about some hot topics. Shelli, do you want to give us an update on that information?
Sure. So one thing he said that wasn't in response to a question, but did kind of just say in passing while he was announcing this mandate, is that, they, assuming people from his office, had let the unions know, which I assume means the IEA and IFT, about this, and that he recommended dealing with the issue at the bargaining table. Now, one thing for those of you out there who are listening, who are responsible for this type of thing, I think it was much more likely that we were going to potentially see impact bargaining related to districts that had decided not to wear masks and how that would be handled for their students where teachers were concerned about possibly, students not wearing masks in class. It probably is not going to be as big of an issue now. We'll talk a little bit about how to handle it if staff are refusing to wear masks or if there's exemptions, but I don't anticipate a lot of bargaining over this particular issue moving forward. In response to questions, he did There was a question asked about remote learning and if we were kind of headed back in that direction, and his response was that is not on the table. So hopefully that remains off the table for as long as we can keep it off the table in Illinois. And then he also was asked, after he indicated that all state employees would be required to be vaccinated as of, I believe it was October 4th. He's giving them some time to do that. One of the reporters asked a question about if teachers were going to be required to be vaccinated. Interestingly, he did not say yes, he did not say no. What he said was something along the lines of he was hopeful that all eligible adults would take advantage of opportunities to be vaccinated. But as we all know, currently, there is no mandate in Illinois for teachers to be vaccinated. So those are kind of some of the other issues he touched upon yesterday.
Okay. Jennifer, now that the state is requiring that schools require masks, what are the implications to schools if they don't comply with that?
Sure. So I'm going to go through 3 hypothetical impacts. So the first would be that whether it's IDPH or, and I'm start with most dramatic, like most immediately impacting, and that would be if IDPH or a local health department took the position that they can literally shut your doors. A building is not safe. It can't be used because the guidance is not being followed or adhered to, and so the building's not safe. That would be the, I think, most extreme and obviously disruptive. You know, literally you couldn't use your school building at that point. We did not see that happen last year. Don't know that it would really happen, but as a hypothetical impact, I think it's out there as a possibility. The second one would be ISB recognition would be at risk. This is a little less hypothetical because we did see some movement last year when districts did not comply. So it would not be surprising if this is another actual impact if a district decided not to follow the mandate. And the third would be tort immunity. We've gotten a lot of questions about that. If something is mandated, so it's not within your discretion to reasonably decide one way or another on what makes sense for your local community to protect health, at this point, it is a mandate. So we think that does have implications to your tort immunity defenses should you be sued. Keep in mind, there's, you know, so to manage that risk, you might want to make a decision. The actual implication of that, you know, someone would have to be harmed by your decision. They file a lawsuit. That's quite a lengthy process. So liability doesn't shut the doors, but these other 2 more so could. So those are all potential impacts.
So thinking a little bit about how this is going to play out and kind of the practical tools as districts try to shift to mandating masks, we've seen a lot of contentious board meetings, some disruptions. Nicki, can you talk to us, give us some tips on how school districts can handle those meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, hopefully with the mandate, the board meetings won't be quite as contentious. You know, I think the hope and expectation in some ways, perhaps some of the motivation behind the order was to take this sort of out of the local hands, obviously, and put it at the state level. And so, you know, hopefully that will translate in parents and community members not sort of being as contentious at a board meeting or even board members, because this decision has been taken out of their hands at this point. But obviously this has been, and, you know, anticipating that it still could be. I think what we're always thinking about at board meetings when these issues come up is balancing folks, you know, rights to be at open meetings, their First Amendment rights to speak at open meetings and to participate in public participation, versus a school district's right, the board's right to carry out the school board's business with some level of decorum and efficiency, and not to put community members in danger, certainly physically, which unfortunately we have seen some physical altercations as well. So that's what we're always balancing. I think practical tips are always to make sure that your board members and your administrators understand what your board policies say. You all should have board policies on decorum. You are certainly able to enforce them. Board presidents reminding folks of those if things start to get heated, referencing them specifically, you know, trying to diffuse the situation through pointing at those types of things, making sure you're evenly and consistently enforcing your public participation policies. So everybody gets their 3 minutes or their 4 minutes, whatever you've put down. Everybody's treated fairly and equally, and everybody gets their chance to speak. Obviously, if things get very contentious, there's physical violence, there's yelling, there's screaming, all of those things. If you are unable to diffuse the situation just through the board or the administrators, obviously law enforcement can be brought in. Again, always an unfortunate situation, but if it rises to that level, that's certainly the place that the board and the district should go if things really do get out of hand.
Okay. Shelli, talk to us a little bit about staff who either refuse to wear masks or maybe who have a medical reason that they're asking for an accommodation about not wearing a mask. Walk us through those issues.
Yeah, so I think that this is the one area that we could potentially see, a union when it's not an accommodation issue, because that obviously is really related to the individual and the HR folks as to work out accommodations. This is going to be an interesting one, though, because it could be that the only accommodation the person is seeking is not to wear a mask, and you might be able to consistently enforce some other sort of accommodation across the board for people, depending on what position they hold. But in terms of the idea of people who don't want to wear masks generally and how you discipline or respond to that, I think that is likely something that you should be talking to unions about in advance if you're concerned in your community of teachers or staff that that's going to be a concern, and just making sure that everyone's on the same page, that this is a mandate from the state, or if it, even before when it was a policy of the board to do it, that if they don't do it, there is going to be some sort of progressive discipline moving through the process as to, making sure that you are complying with the mandate for mask wearing. But again, just like we've been saying for over a year now, all of these issues are really important to get in front of with your union and just make sure you're on the same page. I've got to imagine that in most places, we probably are on the same page with their unions on this issue, especially after yesterday, but just make sure that we're all talking about it so there's no surprises.
That's helpful. Amy, what about students who refuse to wear masks or parents who say that their students aren't going to wear masks?
Yeah, so, similarly, I think we'll talk about in a bit the issue of, those who are seeking a medical exemption from masks or do require an accommodation with that and how to work through that. So putting that aside, which we'll talk through, if that doesn't otherwise apply and we're just dealing with non-compliance with the mask requirement, from the policy legal parameters of the issue, is really that, similar to how it would have been addressed in this past school year. The masking requirements, should be tied to school policies, your board policies and code of conduct, and enforced accordingly. So most likely your student discipline policies and codes of conduct, are either written broad enough or in some circumstances specific enough, that any non-compliance with the mask requirement would be a violation of your student discipline policy and code of conduct. And so it should be treated then accordingly, as such a violation and addressed in a disciplinary manner. If you're seeking to exclude the student for non-compliance, we do think that would then be treated as an out-of-school suspension. But likely, we think it would meet Senate Bill 100's requirement for out-of-school suspensions that the student's continuing presence would pose a safety risk or potential disruption to the learning environment by their continued non-compliance to wear a mask. We understand that school communities throughout the state may be dealing with this issue in various ways. There may be very little non-compliance, and so you might be addressing this when it comes to one or two, students, or a handful, not that many, where you may be dealing with it in one context. And we understand that some of our school communities are, concerned that there may be, many or hundreds of potential, students or parents not complying with this. And so how to actually address those really will be, important to look at on an individual basis to really consider, the number of students and the context in which the non-compliance is occurring, and to work with legal counsel through what would be the best approach approach both legally and practically for your schools. I know as we've talked this through as to how this might play out from just sort of a general approach and a practical approach, a starting place generally, may be that when a student comes to school, and if a student comes to school and doesn't have that mask on, giving them a mask and saying you have to wear the mask. And if there's continued non-compliance, then placing them in a separate location and calling home, and at that point, letting the parent know that they're going to have them pick them up if they're going to not comply. And then what we want to do is then just make sure that you've got that procedurally covered, that if you are sending a student home for non-compliance, that is properly documented then as an out of school suspension. And then if there is continued non-compliance, then working through that again under your policy, and then likely really important then to work through with legal counsel on that, just to help make sure that you're navigating both legally what you need to do to make sure you're set with that, but then also just practically, especially for those of you who may be dealing with this issue with large numbers of students.
Yeah, and we've got a question or a comment that the difference this year as opposed to last year when masks were required is last year, if students weren't going to wear masks, they could be offered remote instruction. And this year, that's not an option. And so you really do have a much more difficult situation where if they're not in school, they are excluded.
It is, and that's why we really say, to have the support through legal counsel, kind of talking through what the context is with the non-compliance, especially if there's a number of issues, because we understand that what the practical approach and what the approach is for some school communities and some districts, depending upon the context of the non-compliance, may just be very different, workable for some, but not workable for others.
So Jennifer, another question we've received a lot is about exemptions, and specifically medical exemptions and students with disabilities. What kind of documentation, how are schools going to manage that?
Yeah, so even with the new mask requirement, there's still the availability of medical exemptions. So looking at students specifically, we don't have updated guidance, but I think that even if it's updated to some degree, we're going to basically be in the same place we were last year, where you can require a medical provider's note from the family before granting a medical exemption. This again is something with some nuance, because you might have information and from other sources that a medical exemption is just extremely obvious. You have enough information to make the decision and you don't need more, especially if you got some last year. We did see some probably fake medical exemption letters last year. We have a protocol and a form that you can use to help weed out and document when someone is not making a valid medical exemption request, because as things escalate, that could be a pathway that people use to challenge is, okay, well, we see that one way to not wear a mask is a medical exemption, so we want one of those, even if, the student doesn't validly qualify. So there may be a need to be a little bit more rigorous on those than even last year, where we did see some funny business. But then keeping in mind, even if you have a medical exemption, the current IDPH guidance, which has not been changed, is that the student then needs to follow other protocols to remain safe. So it talks about using a face shield and 6 feet of distancing. That 6 feet of distancing especially is going to be challenging in some of the ways that we're opening this year. So, and it's going to be onerous for the student. So I think making it clear, that is another way to screen out the non-legitimate request, because it's like, okay, well, now you have to wear a face shield. That's not too much better. I don't know if it's better for people or not, but it's still something on your face. And now you have this 6 foot of distancing, which is really going to somewhat isolate you, depending on how the school's set up and activities are set up. Shelli, did you want to say more about on the staff side?
Yeah, so I was just going to add in there. I mean, I think that we are, likely, and we did last year as well, as Jen mentioned, saw some letters for staff that might not have been legitimate. I think it'll be an interesting thing for us to look at in the both student and staff realm. Did the student or staff member wear a mask last year? Were they might not have liked it, but did they do so? And if this is suddenly look, everything's shifted, right? I think parents were staff were much more willing to say, we're going to follow this mandate. COVID was newer. We didn't know a lot about it. People now think they know everything about it, which I don't think we do yet. But there are different thoughts about this. And we are seeing a real shift in certainly how communities are responding to this, as we've seen at all the board meetings and what's been happening there. So I do think we are going to see a lot of both staff and students come in with letters that successfully wore masks last year. So I think that's going to be something that we could think about. But from a staff perspective, I think that it's going to be an interesting practice to see how we follow it and who it is that's asking for it. Because if it is an unvaccinated person, for instance, who's asking to not wear a mask, do you treat that differently than a vaccinated person who's asking to not wear a mask? And does this person in front of students, or is this person in an office that you can close the door and they can be by themselves? I recently had a request for someone who doesn't want to wear a mask. So it's a secretarial person. And so as an accommodation, they've asked for her own independent office so she can be in there without wearing a mask. And while I'm sure that everybody would like to have that office, we're not able to give that to her. And so looking at other options to make sure that we are able to accommodate the underlying issue she has. And again, remember, if we're talking about accommodations under the ADA, it's not because you're accommodating an inconvenience or someone who isn't comfortable wearing a mask. There does have to still be the underlying disability that we're accommodating. So just making sure that you're working with counsel as to how to accommodate that, because I guarantee you, if you accommodate one, we're going to have to make sure that we're aware of that, because people will know, obviously, and you might get other requests. So just being really consistent with how you're approaching those.
And I see we've got another question in the chat about what about students or staff members who have a household member who is vulnerable or has a health condition. And I know this is something we've dealt with last year. What does it look like this year if there's somebody in the household who's at particularly high risk?
So I've been dealing with this quite a bit. I guess I'm not sure that the question is about the mask exemption, because obviously not wearing a mask at school would make your vulnerable housemate more at risk. But I have been getting questions about, and I think we're going to get to this, so maybe I'll just tease it, but people really wanting to continue with remote learning. And the spoiler is there isn't, unless you've decided to separately, but for COVID purposes, there is not really a remote learning program. So working with those families to figure out, are there additional things we can do to make you feel safe with your children at school? So, and we all kind of know what's on the menu now, extra distancing. Do we do face mask and face shield? Do we put up plexiglass? Do we, what can we do to make this family feel more comfortable that really we've addressed their need? But that is not, the family member's illness is not necessarily a protected category where there's a legal obligation.
Okay, so one more on masking before we move to remote instruction. Nicki, do we have any expectation for additional guidance or more changes, and how can districts prepare at this point?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. And Kendra, maybe we'll hit some of the questions in the Q&A about the section we just went through too before we switch to remote learning. But yes, let's have some more guidance. I feel like when we say it, sometimes it happens. So we'll say it really loudly here. No, we do expect IDPH and ASB to be updating the guidance, obviously now with the mask mandate, but, and we're going to talk about remote instruction coming up. And I think the expectation and the hope is that there'll be additional guidance in that area as well. So I would expect to see some guidance coming down the pike. Obviously, districts themselves should be taking a look at both their external protocols, their internal protocols regarding medical exemptions, masking, all of the things, because for those districts, obviously, that adopted plans that made masking optional, those should be shifted now so that all the expectations are clear. And, I do think we're talking a lot about the potential for student noncompliance, for staff noncompliance. I do think that this is going to look different depending on the district, depending on your situation. And so confer with us, confer with your legal counsel, develop a plan so that this isn't hitting you flat-footed on the first day of school. And so I think that's really the next step for most districts on the masking front. But I know we just wanted just quickly to circle back, because there was a question about, I know, Jen, you went through the sort of possible ramifications for not masking, and one of them was recognition status of ISB, and the question was, well, what does that mean, right? So I'm going to combine another question because someone asked about IHSA sports as well. So the biggest implication of non-recognition is that your funding gets pulled, your state funding gets pulled. The other implication is that you can no longer participate in IHSA or ISA sports. Maybe a lesser implication, maybe a greater one, depending on your perspective on sports. But obviously, IHSA has its own masking policies, so districts should be following those if they're participating. If you can't, I'm assuming IHSA will also have enforcement conversations with school districts in that way. But if you're not complying with the state overall masking requirement and your recognition status gets pulled, that also implicates your ability to participate in high school sports.
There was another question about masking. It says, what if the student is under the age of suspension and not complying with the mask mandate? I guess I would clarify. I know it might be confusing how we're using the term suspension, but if we're talking in Illinois, K-12 education, anytime it's the school's choice to send the kid home and not let them participate in education as opposed to the parent's choice, that is a suspension day. And maybe I can think of a few other exceptions, but in general, in this situation, that's probably a suspension day. And so you have to follow, there's several laws that require you to follow some procedure, some process before you do that. And that can be for any age child. So it can be for even if you have a preschool program, or usually we don't suspend. There's not a lot of times kindergartners get suspended, but it does, again, usually we're using it think of it as an intervention to give us time to do something to correct the behavior. So maybe it's, we don't have the supports in place that day, just broadly speaking, we don't have the supports to correct that behavior. We need the student to go home for a certain period of time to help us get ready to invite the student back and address that problematic behavior. Same thing with masks. If they're not wearing masks, there's no age. Well, if you're below 2, maybe, but I don't think that's what it's talking about. Obviously, if you're below 2, there's not a masking requirement. But if you're one of our students attending, we're sending you home, we need to follow some due process and notice requirements to do that.
Yeah, and we do know that with Senate Bill 100, there are certain things, especially when it comes to expulsion in early childhood, where there's some prohibition. So again, I know I've said it a few times, but it is a good idea to check in with legal counsel on some of these issues in particular, because then we can really work to see, okay, well, what's going to make the most sense for the situation? Who is it that is not complying, and being able to consider these factors to then be able to, consider what's the best response that you're going to take that's going to be best for that particular issue to hopefully ultimately get compliance and that student back in school safely, but also that's going to be, supported for you legally if it continues to be challenged.
Kendra, before we move forward, I just want to touch on one other staff-related mask question that we got. And the question is, if a teacher is on their planning period alone in their classroom with their door closed, are they able to take their mask off while remaining alone? So you have to currently, we can likely fall back on the old IDPH ISB guidance related to when there were exceptions for when teachers did not have to wear masks. I think it's likely that we're going to see them putting those out again, or indicating that those are again still in place. As it exists right now, we have the same universal mandate that we had before, earlier. So I think that likely many of those exceptions and how we apply it will be applicable again. Obviously, the Delta variant is different than the COVID was before, so perhaps there'll be some changes. So I think it's safe to say that, we spoke to IDPH this morning on another issue, and we do understand that they're going to be putting out guidance hopefully by the end of this week. And hopefully that'll be addressed among all the other questions that you have. But I think following best practices and making sure that you're at least complying with the guidance as it existed when we had universal masking before, you're probably in good shape unless we hear differently.
Okay. So
yeah, and I don't know, sorry, I don't know, just quickly, I'm sorry. I know we also had a question about board meetings. And so I know we talked about that a little bit. So I do, just want to remind folks that they should be looking at their board rules, making sure that, they're in place. There are a lot of strategies and tools that boards have, just as a reminder. The question was really about, how to deal with public participation. Can you take folks out of order? Can you shift people around so that you're hearing a variety of voices? You certainly can, although you should just make sure that your policy or your agenda doesn't prevent that from happening. There's also lots of tools that you can use, for example, saying, I know a lot of people are speaking on X side of the issue or Y side of the issue, not requiring them, but is there a spokesperson out there that could speak, and then everybody can register whether they agree, so you're not having 50 people sort of getting up yelling about the same thing. One of the things that I also did want to mention about the law enforcement front, because I did mention that as a tool, it's always a good idea to talk to local law enforcement ahead of time and just get a sense of their willingness, their ability to help and to participate. What happens if you need to issue a no trespass order to someone? All of those things should really be thought about ahead of time. And it's always great to put a plan in place before you're sort of in the moment. So I think as administrators working with your board president to sort of get those pieces in place, I think is a really great idea in advance of any contentious board meetings.
Yeah, I strongly encourage you to check your as Nicki said, you have a policy on excluding community members from activities, and it may surprise you the process that you need to go through. So just double check that, your own policy, the board policies.
Yeah, good points. Okay, so now on to remote instruction. This is a question we're getting a lot. When is it required? When is it permitted? What will it look like? In May, ISB passed a resolution related to remote instruction and significantly limiting it. And then in July, the state superintendent made a declaration. And so they're a little bit different, and I think they've left us with a little, more questions. Shelli, can you walk us through where we are with that?
Sure. So I think, as many of you recall, in May, ISB unanimously passed a resolution giving the state superintendent the authority to make a declaration that effective for the 21-22 school year, there would be only in-person instruction, and that remote instruction would only be applicable for those kids who were ineligible for vaccination and who were under a quarantine order. So it was a really small group of kids that, as we said, could continue to receive remote instruction. We received the declaration, I believe it was July 9th, that the state superintendent put out the declaration that she was authorized to give. That declaration widened the group a little bit by saying that everything in the state of Illinois needs to be in-person instruction, and provided that schools are, though, required to provide remote instruction to those students who are under a quarantine order and either are ineligible for a vaccination or are not vaccinated. So it allowed for those parents who chose not to vaccinate their children to also have remote instruction for the 21-22 school year while they were under a period of quarantine. And this is such a narrow group of kids. And I think that, for those of the clients that we've been dealing with across the state, there is still somewhere this sense that this idea that medically fragile kids can still have remote instruction. We're going to talk about options that could be available, but as a general principle, what was afforded to families last year is not permitted anymore by ISB. So I think that's a really important thing for everyone to understand. And we don't know yet what remote instruction is even supposed to look like during the period of quarantine for kids. So we are expecting, we've been told guidance will be coming. We said May guidance will be coming. It's now August and schools are starting. I've not seen any as to what it looks like, but we don't know if it's going to look anything like, or has to look anything like it did last year, Kendra.
Okay, and I mean, neither the resolution nor the declaration nor the FAQ and the webinar that were all up at the beginning of the summer, those are all not on the website anymore. Do we read anything into that? Do we have any additional insights?
Kendra, this is, I think, one of the more confusing things. And hopefully they're just kind of putting it all together in some new format that they're going to push out to everyone. But yeah, when you go onto their website now, any of the links that were available to any of these pieces are no longer valid. So, certainly it is not our belief that there's going to be some radical change coming and that that's why it's gone. But as far as why it's not on the website anymore, I think we can just, go on what's the state superintendent put out to all superintendents in July as to who can have remote instruction.
Okay. And we've got a couple of questions here about who qualifies. You have a student who has symptoms, but is not like a close contact in order to quarantine. Do they qualify for remote instruction under this resolution?
I think then you look back at that IDPH symptom chart that we have, or it's called something else, not the symptom chart. But
a decision tree, I think.
Decision tree, I'm sorry. I have not thought about the tree in so long. But decision tree, I think you look under that and indicate, I think under there indicates that someone who's symptomatic is supposed to stay home and isolate. I think that would be someone who would potentially qualify. I don't know if anybody thinks differently. I think we're gonna have to interpret this, as cases come up, but I certainly think they would likely qualify.
Yeah. I think I think I was going to say, Shelli, as you said, the word isolation, like I think, when we talk about isolation, that's when someone is, symptomatic or has tested positive versus the quarantine, which is referred to when there's that exposure. So that's where I think there may be that difference, which again, absolutely looking back at that decision tree to then see how this would play out.
So I took the question slightly differently. In addition, I think the question referenced, do you need an actual order from the local health department, or is this something, can it be issued through the district? So we actually raised this issue with ISB a while back, because I know some public health departments don't actually issue the orders in the same way that others do. And I believe it was in some guidance, although we can't find any of it right now. But I do believe when we spoke with ISB, the idea was that if you were quarantining someone consistent with public health guidance, that would also qualify a student for remote learning. And I believe that's where ISB landed on that. So
yeah. Nicki, on that point, if I can just add in here, and I probably should have been clear when I was distinguishing between the two, the other distinguishing point between what happened in the resolution and in the declaration, the resolution says they're under a quarantine order by a local public health department or Illinois Department of Public Health. The actual declaration says only while they are under quarantine consistent with guidance or requirements from a local public health department. So I think that's likely how they got around this issue of many health departments, as we know, not actually issuing orders. So it's now if they're under quarantine consistent with, and perhaps they should have said under quarantine or isolation consistent with to address the tree. But certainly I think those people would likely qualify. It still begs the question of what are they qualifying for though, in terms of what we're doing for them.
Okay, so given that that's a really limited group of kids still that are going to be eligible, are there other options for districts to offer remote instruction for students that don't qualify, who aren't currently quarantining?
Yes, I'll touch on one that I have spoken to a number of districts about, and that is something called the Remote Learning Program. Now, this is a pre-COVID. This is not something that was developed in response to COVID, and it's under Section 10-29 of the school code. And it says that it is a remote educational program that provides an opportunity for qualifying students to participate in an educational program delivered by the district in a location outside the district. And then it goes on to indicate that the board has to adopt a policy. The policy has to be approved by ISB, and the policy itself has to set forth the general parameters of what the plan for the individualized student will provide for in terms of how instruction will be provided, how it'll best serve the needs of the student. And the district and the parent have to decide together that this program outside of school will best meet the educational needs of the student. What I have cautioned districts about, and I will continue to do so, is that for districts that adopt this policy, it may give parents the impression that what they are going to be providing their children is the same sort of remote learning experience that they were provided last year. And considering I'm primarily a labor lawyer, I will say that I have, I'm unaware of many of our teachers who are going to be willing, nor should they be asked in every instance, to perform the same type of dual learning that they were doing, dual instruction rather, that they were doing before. So having students zoom into the classroom as well as students present in the classroom. My sister is also a teacher, so I have heard a lot about that personally in my life. So I think that that is where the confusion is going to come from, is that these parents who want their children out of school for whatever reason, whether because of the student's health issue or family health issue, if your district has adopted this policy, you need to be really clear with parents about what you're able to provide and why it's not necessarily going to look at all like what you were being provided last year under your remote program.
Jennifer, what about a home hospital? Is that an option that districts can use to kind of get around this limitation on remote?
Right, that's the main option that a lot of districts are explaining, that either you come to school, you're under quarantine and you get that limited remote support. That's not the same as we had last year. Or as always, you could qualify for home hospital instruction. So home hospital, that historically it's for students who are literally in the hospital and can't come to school, or are so ill, have a medical condition that's so severe that a doctor certifies they can't be in school. So it may be that we get home hospital certifications this year that are really directed at COVID because of the fragility. Normally they could tolerate school. They're not so medically fragile. They can't tolerate instruction, which is typically more so what we get. Although sometimes school anxiety there are students who can sustain normally too, but this is an odd thing that you might have a larger group of students that truly could sustain quite a bit of instruction. So it's not designed for that. It's not like we had last year. It contemplates an hour a day is the sort of standard. It's the minimum, but it's also the typical amount that can be modified up and down depending on the student's individual needs. But kind of what you get usually is 5 hours a day. So much like Shelli said, right? Yeah, much like Shelli said, the alternative remote program's not going to meet expectations. If parents think, well, I'll get a home hospital certification and have a robust or even like adequate, normal-ish remote program at home, that's not, it's usually someone feeding assignments that the class is doing and giving a little support an hour a day just to keep the student up until they can come back into the class.
Okay, and just to clarify, we've got a couple of questions here about, are there specific requirements for what remote learning is going to look like for those students who are quarantining? Nikki, can you?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, we have no guidance right now from ISB. And I really think that, and just to reiterate this point, so I think for the third time, I think people really need to be thinking about this as just, the idea is to keep kids sort of afloat while they're out on quarantine. It's not, again, it's not, it's supposed to last for the limited time of quarantine. It's supposed to keep kids engaged and up to date on the curriculum, but there are no parameters as of yet. Now, ISB could come out with guidance tomorrow saying you need to do 2.5 hours of synchronized learning. We haven't seen that. Our expectation is that it's not going to look like that. The idea is to just keep those kids engaged until they do return from quarantine. But as of this point, we have no parameters set by ISB for that remote learning.
Okay. Jen, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, to add to that, just in case anyone was anxious, I think that statement makes us all anxious. If we did get some sort of guidance that you had to do what you did last year, no one that I've talked to, that is not their plan. The plans that I've heard are ways to get sort of what I was talking about with home hospital, maybe a teacher supported communication system to get some assignments that the class is doing to kind of keep up a little bit on assignments and work. I've heard some that are doing maybe a Zoom drop-in that you can go and ask a teacher, group setting, not individual, some questions, but it's not a robust day-long program by any stretch.
Okay, so turning to quarantine, it does seem like the rules are getting a bit more complicated. So for schools trying to figure out who is a close contact and who needs to quarantine, Nicki, can you kind of walk us through how to approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. But, I do want to stress that obviously guidance is constantly coming out. I really encourage folks to look at IDPH and CDC. Obviously, they have the most up-to-date guidance right now on definition. So under the IDPH definition of a close contact, you obviously we have the same obligation of it's for students. Well, let's talk about the exclusions. I think that's easier. So fully vaccinated people who remain asymptomatic and those who have a COVID infection in the last 90 days are excluded from the quarantine rules. For students exposed in schools, those within 3 to 6 feet of someone who tests positive for COVID are not treated as close contacts as long as both students are properly and consistently wearing masks and all your other mitigation measures are in place. So I think one sort of positive ramification, as we talked about before, of the new mask mandate is that we will hopefully see less folks who are actually being quarantined because they are not considered close contact, again, in the school setting, if they're within 3 to 6 feet and they're both masked. It's a little unclear to us right now whether it seems like those would not be close contacts that you would then report to your local health department if they are excluded from the definition, but we are seeking clarity on that from some of our local health folks because we want to make sure that you are reporting. And so, at this point, that's the definition we're working with. Again, a little bit of a moving target, but that's where we're at.
Okay, so Shelli, can you give us some additional information on quarantining and getting out of quarantine and what that looks like?
Yeah, obviously, with the new guidance that came out from the CDC and IDPH, there are different avenues for getting out of quarantine that we did not have available to us. And I think Amy's going to talk a little bit about the Test to Stay program as well. But in terms of even in those districts where that might not be applicable for whatever reason, there are different ways that you can get out of it. And I think the significant thing is that IDPH was clear that the decision making with respect to who and how long someone has to quarantine rests with the local health department. So that's repeatedly stated in the IDPH guidance that we have. Now, I think that why that's significant is that some local health departments may have different rules, both about length of time as well as the enforcement authority on the quarantine and isolation. And what IDPH has told us is that that the local health departments do have authority to make those modifications should they deem them appropriate based upon the circumstances in their community. So I think that that's an important piece for all of you to understand kind of where your specific county falls with respect to your health department's authority. We do know that it is still a requirement that schools report within 3 hours under the law any positive cases of COVID to their local health department. The law goes on to say really that it's literally anyone has the responsibility to make a report to the local health department if it has not been done. And then the process that's followed thereafter with respect to close contact also varies from county to county. I know there are some that have put out lengthy forms that need to be filled out as to who's a close contact, but I think as Nicki mentioned, we are not sure at this point as to whether or not someone who doesn't now fall under the definition of close contact, so for instance a vaccinated person, would have to be identified on those forms and provided that information to the local health department. We're not sure yet kind of how those two things are going to intersect together.
Okay, so Amy, can you tell us a little bit more about this Test to Stay?
Yeah, so as Shelli talked about, there are these various options now, laid out in the current IDPH ISB guidance, which we're expecting, an updated version of that. But currently, as it stands, there's these various options for how long quarantine should be, with that qualifier that Shelli referenced, that really it's up to the local health department to make the decision as to who is going to quarantine and for how long. But one of those options is this Test to Stay program and strategy. So as long as the mask mandate is in effect, this would be applicable for all schools, assuming the local health department, gives its blessing to do so, and would help to ensure that healthy students are not unnecessarily excluded from school. And so under the current version of the, how it's laid out under the current FAQ that was issued on August 2nd, the test to stay strategy involves it or sets forth that if a school's test close contacts on days 1, 3, 5, and 7 from the date of exposure, and if that test is done by a PCR or rapid antigen or molecular emergency use authorization approved test, that then those close contacts would be permitted to remain in the classroom so long as the results are negative and continue to be negative. And the reason why it's now, sort of would be likely applicable for all schools with a new mask mandate is because under the current FAQ, it states that the test to stay strategy is only applicable when both the COVID-19 confirmed student and close contact were engaged in consistent and correct use of well-fitting masks, and if the school, regardless of vaccination status, is requiring universal masking. So now with that mask mandate, all schools would really fall under that bucket, right? And so the test to stay strategy can be used for indoor exposure, but there is an exception for household exposure. So if you have any students or individuals who have had exposure due to someone in their household, they would be excluded from the ability to have the test to stay strategy applied. And any students who are engaged in the test to stay strategy after an exposure could still participate in extracurricular activities, assuming again that those tests are negative. But there is the qualifier, not only just that general qualifier for local health department decision making when it comes to quarantining, but specifically with the test to stay strategy, the current FAQ acknowledges that the local health department has the authority to assess high risk exposures and order a traditional quarantine without the option for test to stay. So depending upon the individual circumstances of the exposure or the particular transmission rates of that particular community, would we see the local health department, pulling that away for certain areas as an option, possibly, but hopefully that will be an option for many of our schools to employ.
Great. Okay. So it's possible we can avoid some of the quarantines if people are vaccinated. And yesterday, the governor really stressed the importance of vaccinations and encouraging everyone to get vaccinated who's eligible. Nicki, do you want to talk a little bit about things schools can do to encourage staff to get vaccinated?
Sure. Definitely they should be encouraging everybody to get vaccinated because it is the most effective prevention against COVID. So, obviously your, other incentivizing, discussions can be around the fact that your need to quarantine is diminished. Obviously, there's no more FFCRA, so people taking their own benefit time could be potentially encouraging for folks to get vaccinated, to seek that vaccine. Again, sometimes districts are actually offering leave benefits for those who are vaccinated, but either get COVID or have to care for someone who is ineligible for a vaccine, like their child, and they have to quarantine. So, offering those leave benefits may also incentivize. I mean, we know that there's a very, very small percentage of people who are getting breakthrough infections, but then you're covering their leave time. There are some districts I know that are going the route of incentives. The EOC said you can do that. So, some are thinking about that. And we've seen obviously incentives at the local city levels and at the state levels and at the federal levels. So you can't incentivize family members, but you can incentivize your staff members. So Jen, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that front.
Nope, I took the words right out of my mouth, Nicki.
Excellent. All right, well then, Jennifer, let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about the 2 new special education laws dealing with transition students that were just signed into law. There's a lot of confusion about these. The drafting is not maybe as clear as it could be. So can you kind of walk us through the implications of those new laws?
Sure. So there's one new law, House Bill 40. That one is pretty straightforward. If you turn 22, you used to immediately stop having services. You're done with the district. But now if you turn 22 during the school year, you can finish the school year. And that's not just this year, that's every year. So you turn 22, you finish the school year. Okay. The other one is the one that I find confusing. It's House Bill 2748. And that's where there's a lot of scrambling right now because school districts have to give notice to students who this applies to that they may be eligible for additional services this year if their birthday was during a 3-month closure during COVID. If you're not CPS and you had a less than 3-month closure for the 1920 school year, so you closed March 17th and your school year was done or more, before June 17th, so you didn't have a 3-month closure. Really, we're talking about students who turned 22 during the 2021 school year, assuming that you had a 3-month closure that year when they turned 22. So it's actually a somewhat narrow group of students, but then they would be eligible for services. The services they'd be eligible, that's another complication that probably requires more than 2 minutes. But the immediate thing on your plate would be to get those 30-day notices out, and then to understand that there is I think a staffing implication here, because normally you have students roll off of needing transition services throughout the year, but you might have a big bubble come through this year. So that's my short version.
Okay, and I think there are going to be so many questions about the individual circumstances of, we were providing hybrid learning, or this was, do these 3 months count, and this student, took their diploma, and do they still get to come back? I think there are going to be a lot of iterations on what this looks like that we're going to have to work through and figure out.
Yeah, there's they have to continue to be residents. There's different implications for private day students. And there's a lot of implications of this. So just wanted to give the high level summary.
Yeah, and I think the funding implications are also complicated as well, because these kids are not eligible under IDEA anymore. So IDEA funding can't be used, creating a whole other fun set of issues. So I know we've had a couple additional questions come in at the last minute here. Does anybody want to tackle? Amy, I think you had one you wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I saw a question just about that sort of, exception that we see in the FAQ on this test to stay strategy, that the FAQ states that it may be used for any indoor exposure with the exception of household exposures. So that's what the FAQ says. So, I take that to mean that you could apply it to not only exposures in school, but if somebody comes with another, exposure that was indoors that may be, outside of their household, that the local health department may allow that to be used for that. I see the exception of household exposures, meaning very specifically if somebody within someone's household has tested positive and that is the means by which they've been exposed, then, likely because of just the nature of that close proximity, the FAQ currently says that it wouldn't be applicable for those household exposures. So hopefully that clarifies that.
Okay, do we have any other final thoughts for our listeners as we deal with all of these new developments and prepare for the school year?
The only thing I would just say is just make sure that you're adjusting your policies and your procedures in light of the mask mandate. A lot of boards last month adopted policies. You're really going to need to go back to your board and have them approve the adjusted policies and protocols. So just make sure you're doing that in a timely fashion so that it's both enforceable and your board is, weighing in on the issue. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you to everybody who is listening, and I'm sure we will be in touch as we continue to work through this.